Hey there, David.
Hey, Kathleen, what's going on?
Not a whole heck of a lot. Is that what type of thing? Okay. Uh, so how are you feeling about all this?
I feel good. I mean, wow, it's up to you. I mean, you guys have all the real water to carry.
Yeah.
So, but I feel good about it. No, I think folks even into the last day here have been registering. You all have been, dovetailing your talks even more. So I think we're doing good. I really
Yeah,
do.
I think it's helpful to have people's slideshows so you can really see where you can lean on them because I'm gonna be really paying attention so I don't do a lot of repeating, but I might be referring
Yeah,
back as saying, as Tori said, as
right.
April will say, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important that there is repetition's not necessarily bad, but when your time is tight.
Right, 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 right.
Yeah, I'm excited that this is happening. I can't believe how long have been when we've been working on.
It's professionals, agency representatives from county government, local fire agencies, realtors that work across residential landscapes. So really, this amazing cross section of people that touch residential landscapes, and for which we're hoping to coach you up, give you resources and information to be a resource for homeowners. As we all work together to create these resilient landscapes. I want to ask and invite Kathleen Cutter from Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority to just share a few words about the purpose of today's training. And then we'll go into a little bit of housekeeping and we'll then move into that lineup of presenters. Kathleen?
Thank you, David. Thank you first of all for all of you being here. We know that you guys have time to be doing your work and taking the time out to do this is really really is important to us. So I just wanted to touch on why we're having this class, and basically it's to answer a very important need, which is basically the response that we've had from our defensible space inspections here in Marin County. When people get their defensible space report that is the result of their inspection, there's often a lot of emotion tied around it. And some of it's really positive, but sometimes there's confusion. Like, what are they being asked to do? How do they do it? There's also fear maybe of fire, and that's a real fear, and maybe of enforcement or of change to their property, or they're concerned that it's going to be like moonscaping. So this kind of comes up with some resistance to make that change. They don't want to give up their garden aesthetic. They don't really want to be told what to do, and they can't visualize what it might look like to have a beautiful fire smart garden. And they don't have anybody to do it right. They just don't trust anybody, or have confidence that maybe their landscaper knows what to do. And so what residents are basically asking for, they're asking for guidance. But the fire department's really good at telling you, okay, this is a fire hazardous plan, or this is something that has to be removed, but they're really not good in telling you how to replant or what to do instead. That's not their role. So we wanted to have a class that we could provide for landscape professionals. So to help them understand what the report is asking the residents to do and the whys behind that ask. We wanted to provide guidance on how to approach solutions for these residents. And we also wanted to have some sort of way of vouching for these professionals that they've taken a class or they have some level of proficiency. And that's what we're here to start this with. This is just the first of many classes we hope to have. And we'll have your emails, and we'll hopefully be able to tell you of future classes. But one thing going into this, I really want you to keep in mind, what are the goals that your clients have? Are they looking to be fire, ready for fire? Are they wanting just to be code compliant? And the third thing is, do they really just want to make sure that they keep their insurance? Those are two or three
Great.
different ways of uh, being ready for, what you're when you do work on the property. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to David.
Okay. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. Participants will be muted throughout this session and the chat is off. We encourage you, and the question and answer feature is on. And just that's a way for me to introduce Bella. Bella Zare is on here as our Zoom producer. She's going to help us monitor that Q&A feature and use it towards the end of the program to open things up and have our presenters answer your questions. So please use the Q&A feature today for today's program. There won't be any breaks in the middle, so just take care of yourself. So you got to get up and get a new cup of tea. Please go do it. The dog wants out. Whatever you need to do, just do that. Couple quick things, and we'll do some housekeeping at the end, but we can get you, if you want to and want to have a certificate of completion for this program, we'll route that to you here afterwards. There'll be a survey we have you take so that we can do that. Similarly, for taking this class, you can have your business listed on Fire Safe Marin's website as having done this landscape resilience workshop. We really want to make sure you know that there are offerings by Fire Safe Marin around home hardening, of some really nice trainings coming online on what you do around home hardening. And of course, we have Steve Quarles today that'll talk a little bit about that so you have context. But this today is about the landscaping. And so that certificate of completion, that listing on Fire Safe Marin will be about resilient landscapes, and that you've gone through this 2-hour workshop and training. I think beyond that, I want to then just move us into our agenda. We've got kind of 2 sections. One's about the science and how that science is going into policy and what we know and how it informs landscape decisions. And then the other component of the program is really demonstrated practices, chances to see before and after and understand how defensible space inspection reports play into that. So with that, I want to introduce Jana Valikovic. Jana is a UC Cooperative Extension Forestry Advisor, has worked really closely with California's Board of Forestry on some new guidelines that are out, among other things in the fire and forestry arena. And Jana, just thank you for being here. And just to all of our panelists, thank you for the ways you've worked hard to integrate your talks and what we think bring our attendees a really well-balanced presentation about science and practice. Jana, please, the floor is yours.
All right, good afternoon. Can everybody see my slides?
We do.
Okay, well, terrific. I'm going to talk about this at the high level, and I know that for whatever reason, you've come to this program out of curiosity, interest, looking for answers, and I'm going to open with some kind of general thoughts and general ways to talk about the wildfire issue, in part because I think you may need to be a translator to some of your clients who may have a skeptical view about what we're talking about, who may have confusion, questions around, really, is there true flammability in plants and vegetation? And, what do I have to do? How do I think about this complex topic? So my work involves a lot of post-fire investigations. It involves a number of research projects in partnership with Dr. Steve Quarles and others, just really trying to understand what resistance looks like in the landscape to wildfire, how to really build that fire adaptation framework so that we can all live long lives in California, protect our assets, protect our families, and have a viable future, both economically and personally into the future. So I just want to start by saying, the wildfire issue is really an existential crisis that is transforming the state. We've had over 14 million acres burn. It's about 1 out of every 7 acres in California. If you haven't driven across the state, you can't drive a highway without seeing landscapes that have had significant change, especially in their forests. And, there's been some good fire in there, but there's been a lot of really high severity fire. And within that, we're all caught up in that. It's impacting our health, it's hurting our finances. And, as you're quite aware, I'm sure that it's impacting the ability to sell and insure our homes. This issue, has not been unnoticed by the insurance industry. And with, that, very critical relationship we have with the private sector in the insurance industry, we have to figure out how to better mitigate the risks and have them understand a way to price that risk. So, if you're confused about the insurance industry, the rest of us are with you too. But what you're going to experience today, hopefully, will help you navigate some of those challenges. And, I just want to refresh on kind of what that fire smoke relationship is. And it really connects across the whole state. And as you start to think about, we're all in this together, just to bring a number for how to quantify what this indirect effect is. On average, our per capita household expenses have gone up $3,000 a year in the last couple of years, related to increased costs in utilities and increased costs related to insurance. So even if we haven't seen wildfire in our local communities, we're all getting that kind of downstream economic effect because of this shared challenge that we're facing. So, why now? Why are we talking about this? And that's, largely because wildfire will always be a part of California's future. We live in a Mediterranean climate that has a prolonged drought period, and that makes our vegetation, our built structures primed for fire ignition if something is to occur. And so, this framework around fire adaptation and mitigation has really become front and center in the policy and regulatory world. And we're going to talk about defensible space today. And, that is a regulatory framework, but it's really an educational program. And what we're trying to do here is see kind of our role in helping residents and homeowners, prepare for future fire exposures and bring forward that both design and maintenance approach that can better position themselves for future exposures. Today, we're going to talk a lot about something called embers, which you can see in this image where there's a lot of fluid dynamics visible. You can see the swirling patterns, both horizontally on the left-hand side, vertically on the right. And, this image, gives you a direct view on what might be combustible in a landscape and kind of the challenge that one individual might have in trying to, do some direct work to try and suppress that fire. But it also shows something really profound to me, and that if you look to the right-hand side of the firefighter is this bright yellow, bright red, bright white line, and clearly that's fire, but why is it so intense on that side? What is contributing to so much of the pattern landing here on this right-hand side? And what that's about is that despite the look of the streaking here, the wind is traveling from the left to the right, and with it, it is carrying bits of burning debris, and that debris is colliding with this exterior wall, and those hot coals, in essence, are falling to the base of the wall and collecting right at the edge of the wall. So even if wildfire in the flaming front is farther away from your specific location, these embers can be lofted in the wind column in front of the fire, and they start to interact with our built environment, our homes, our landscapes. And if they find combustible things, it may lead to ignition, and it may lead to ignition in places that we're not prepared for. So this concept around defensible space is about trying to see and anticipate where those ignitions might occur surrounding our properties. And then the concept of home hardening is trying to bring forward ideas in places where we might harden the structure so that those embers or flames or heat don't cause damage to the structure. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about fuel and what fuel is. And, I was referring a moment ago to vegetation, but it can include many other items such as artificial turf, garbage cans, recreational vehicles, fencing, mulch, some of our built structures, including hot tubs, as well as our plants, shown here in the bottom middle, where the plants that we often put next to our buildings, to the hedges that we do for privacy, and even to some of the things we do to decorate some structures like a vine on a block wall. I bring this forward because I'd like to try and dial your eyes into thinking about what may burn in a future fire, and then trying to decide whether or not it's a comfortable, is it allowable in your mind? If that does ignite, will it cause some level of risk to your structures or your client's structures? So how do we get to these situations like the Eaton fire, where a wildfire starts in the wildland landscape, and before we know it, it's just engulfed a whole community? This is an image from the 2025 firestorm in Los Angeles. This is from Altadena, and it moved incredibly quickly. It had voracious winds on it, and Those winds are not unique to Southern California. They are evident in many communities throughout California, including parts of the Bay Area, including areas in and around Marin. And so becoming more aware of when we hit these critical fire weather conditions, how prepared are we? So I want to show kind of a theoretical framework and talk about how defensible space and home hardening fits into this. The idea is that if fire is traveling through that wildland landscape, and especially when it's being driven and pushed by wind, or if you get a plume collapse, meaning the column of the smoke and debris that's getting moved into the air column then collapses down onto a certain area, you can get the same dynamic. But as the fire is moving through that landscape, at some point it transitions into a residential environment and residential landscaping, and it may move on the vegetation as moving from the right to the left. It may connect into the fences, and then if the fence panel goes all the way to the black house, we could have flames touching that black house. If the black house ignites as a result of the fence connecting and it starts to ignite, then you can see that there may be a relationship of radiant heat exposure or maybe even flame contact between the black house and the white house in the middle. And there can be multiple forms of transmission. There could be multiple ignition pathways, including this ember dynamic, which I'm showing on the top of these communities. And embers moving some distance into the community, and they may be able to go in through a skylight or a sliding glass door that's open or enter one of the vents. And then you start to have an environment where there are multiple houses that are engulfed in flame, and you get this kind of domino effect that one house leads to the next with multiple ignitions occurring. The wind can also shift, and you can have fire then moving in another pattern in another direction, either through other forms of fuel, such as a hedge or as a fence. And pretty soon, it's a very big event with many resources needed and probably an evacuation being triggered because the event is so significant. So why home hardening and defensible space? How can it prevent this process? Well, simply what it's trying to do is break the pathways, break the links in the chain. So in this initial concept where we were talking about the black house, the idea would be if we had the ability to replace the gate or the fence panel as the wood fence connects to the house with something non-combustible, then that first ignition point might not occur. The fence might not lead to ignition of the house. If the next houses are also hardened or the windows are closed or elements like that, we might not see ignition of the next house. Further, if there isn't connected fuel between each of these houses, then there are further breaks in the chain and more likelihood that fewer homes will ignite, leaving resources able to focus on evacuation and maybe some less element of structure protection. So that's the concept that we're trying to work from. So how does that play out in real life? And how do we think about the role that vegetation has near and adjacent to homes? I just want to share one video. This comes from a laboratory setting where there's some arbavita here, which is a conifer. It's planted, it's still in its pot, it's well irrigated. This is an example where a small shed may be ignited. They use 25-mile-an-hour winds, and this is a wood structure where you can see the interaction here. And so what you can see just from the top information is that it takes about 7 minutes of flame exposure and heat to ignite those very healthy and saturated with water irrigated plants. But what's more significant is that in about 15 more seconds, you can see here the ignition of the building. This experiment was replicated without the vegetation, and what happened in that situation is that the building did not ignite. So why I'm bringing this forward here is because vegetation can be an additive fuel that can create more compounding risk for the structure itself. So There's been a couple more experiments that have been happening since here to try and give some visuals on what this relationship is between things that seem like they're well hydrated and in a position to be maybe protective. But what is happening is that the heat from this burning adjacent shed is causing the stomata on the plants to close off to protect the resources of water within the plant. And so the plant cannot access the water that's in the pot or in the ground quickly enough before they become overwhelmed and overcome by that flame exposure. So just to give some sense of how this dynamic works between fuel adjacent to structures is in part what this image is meant to display. So we're going to talk more today about kind of the ingredients for home survival. The main takeaway is that it's a coupled approach related to both reduction and I'm going to use the term disconnection of fuel between the house and the property. That's more colloquially known as defensible space. Dr. Quarles is going to talk about structure hardening. I just want to enter this framework around homeowner maintenance and the folks that help homeowners in their maintenance, as well as fire personnel. So we're going to be working around these concepts today and trying to help see where we may be able to provide some better guidance to your clients and to our community members. California's been thinking about fuel modification for a long time. The concept of defensible space came around in 1965, and it's not a new term. It's probably best known in the forested environment, but it applies across many jurisdictions throughout the state, which I'll give some more information about later on as I start to wrap up. But in 2020, California enacted new legislation to be able to address this ember-related issue and added a new zone, which is around the first 5 feet of structures known as Zone 0. And so we are moving to a place where we have 3 zones of defensible space. And those exist in that first 5 feet, working from the house outwards, and then Zone 1 from 5 feet to 30 feet, and then Zone 2 from 30 to 100 feet. The purposes of these zones are really about both structure protection as well as firefighter safety and effectiveness. So this first 5 feet is really about preventing structure ignition. It's about trying to keep the structures on the property in a condition where they are not going to ignite. So that includes even this small outbuilding as illustrated here on the image. Zone 1 is about trying to disconnect the fuel so that if fire is advancing, it's not going to burn directly to the structure. There's not just this one plant to the next to mulch to the next item. And then Zone 2, if the properties are large enough, are really about fire suppression capacity, reducing flame height so that firefighters can both safely stage to protect that structure as well as be effective, meaning that the flames are not so big, so tall that they will not be successful in that effort. So I'm going to talk more about the Zone 0 because the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection is responsible for developing the regulations on this new rule. So what's in the new draft standard? And this is hot off the presses. The board just released their latest draft about a week and a half ago, and I'm going to try and explain what's in that draft. So this is kind of work in progress, but it appears that we're leading towards a more settled condition and with hope for resolution on exactly what those state standards will be in the next couple of months. With it, it has an approach that, it's not about plant lists, because if we look at this lavender here, we can see that plant condition changes over time. Maintenance is particularly important, and plants have, a lot of different phases. And so, we can't just rely on plant lists. And it also approaches it from the frame that the standards will be written for all different types of building styles, building construction conditions, levels of maintenance. And so you're going to see that Zone 0 is trying to be responsible enough to these great variability in structures and in vulnerability in structures. So it has to be equally understood. And it's not easy to do inspections on kind of this whole range of building construction styles, but more to be able to say like the structures need protection overall. So what you'll see from Dr. Quarles is, some more information specifically about where those weak points are in buildings, around windows and heat and gates, as we've talked about earlier, the heat trapping ability under the eaves, the vulnerability of the edge of the wall, decks, and vents. So this is the state draft standard. This is kind of the minimum protection standards. The recommendation and best practice is a full 5 feet of protection. But from at least a minimum standard perspective, the new draft says Zone 0 is still a full 5 feet, clarifies that trees can be within that 5 feet as long as the ladder fuels or the lower branches have been pruned up so that fire will not climb into the canopy of the tree. It also focuses on looking at the individual structure itself and our concept around the eave and the depth of the eave and a drip line, giving at least a minimum standard of nothing combustible underneath the eaves. So in this example, the eave is 1 foot on the left side, and on the right side, it's 2.5 feet. And then working out from the drip line to for the rest of the 5 feet, there is some tolerance for low combustibility items and some potted plants. So I'll describe what those look like in a minute. And then just kind of a top-down view where you might anticipate that these are trees and these are smaller planting groups. And this idea of having our walkways much closer to the structure themselves, and then our gardening a little farther out from the structure. Trees always become a great point of conversation, and the standards are about 5 feet of clearance above the roof and 10 feet separation from chimneys. And so these boxes here are meant to illustrate the point where thought and consideration and extra effort might be given, and some thought about where the trimming would be recommended. So I've got some images to try and reflect on what that might look like. So from a tree perspective, as well as a fuel reduction perspective, this house would meet these new state standards. Some additional examples from kind of older construction styles and more bungalow dynamics. These are images that are edited in Photoshop, so they're not a perfect representation of it, but it's an attempt to try and communicate what these space standards might involve. Again, you can see that there's more separation given around the base of these structures, and less material right up to the walls, the windows, the vents, and such. So the state standards here, as I said earlier, the idea would be that that there may be some low combustibility vegetation allowed, but it's within conditions. It's focused on trying to keep the combustibles, including vegetation, away from the wall to the eave drip line, and from the eave drip line to 5 feet. A tolerance for small potted plants in non-combustible containers, so not in a wood pot. That there could be some lawn or other ground cover with a 3-inch maximum height, and that there could be some color spots, some annual or perennial plants, or herbaceous plants, I just want to say. So bulbs might be appropriate in that place. The standards will also speak to gates, decks, and fences, with the idea that where you have a fence panel or gate attached to the structure, that first 5 feet of either would be replaced with something that's non-combustible over time. That no new combustible fences would be allowed, but you could repair current fences, and that sheds and outbuildings in Zone 0, so that first 5 feet, must be finished in non-combustible materials or relocated out of Zone 0. So just some images on what ground cover is. So the idea being, pavers with some low plantings that are naturally self-limiting in height, like these ground covers here. Herbaceous plants certainly could bring a lot of color to that low combustibility zone, and can include native plants, as well as, kind of our common color spots that we put in some of these locations, like pansies and petunias and such. Succulents would be another option, as long as they're not thatching and building up dead material. Metal gates, lots of new availability in the metal gate arena. A lot of them are really beautiful and not that expensive. And so as I wrap up here, I've got 2 last slides. I just want to give you a sense of what that visual transition might look like. So the image on the left is a before example. You can see some of the additional vegetation right in these locations, and some planters right on the deck against the house. And you can see how that might be modified to meet this Zone 0 standard and give some more protection on the base of the wall near the windows and those weak areas. So as a last slide, where and when do these new rules apply? And I'm going to give some acronyms: SRA and LRA. So the state rules apply to those areas that are state responsibility area. And they also apply to very high classifications of local responsibility areas. That's about a third of Marin's wildland urban interface properties as currently mapped. And so if you want to look at what these maps might look like, this is just a screenshot, and you can look at the fire hazard severity zones, and you can follow this link. I'll text that to you in a minute, Bella, so you can put it into the chat if we need it, and be able to see where your properties or your clients' properties might be. Now this sets the state minimum standards, and so just keep in mind that local fire has the ability to write their own standards as long as they are equivalent or greater. And so there are 17 agencies within the Marin Fire Agency ecosystem. And as I understand that once the Board of Forestry and Fire Protections rules are finished, they will then make some consideration as to what their standards will be for the other 2/3 of the wildland urban interface properties within Marin County. So the state rules apply immediately for new construction. So building new, the idea would be that these concepts would be in the permitted process, and then it will be phased in for existing homes. The approach is really about education over penalties. But I just want to say it's very critical for property sales. If you're not aware, there are inspections for property sales, and there is a lot more disclosure around home hardening and defensible space as part of the process of having a property go on market, and for the buyer to be able to have better information around what the expectations are. So I will close from there, and hope that can set as a framework for how we move forward in conversation and talking about this. So thank you, David. I know that was a lot, and I appreciate
It's okay. No, wonderful start. And we're going to move here on to Tori Norville, our fire science advisor. As Tori brings up her presentation, 2 quick things that Jana's presentation reminds me to stress. We have tailored this to some degree focused on Marin County, but we also hope that this lets you that are joining us from Sonoma, Napa, even the broader Bay Area, begin to tap into those state resources and get inside this topic that helps you. And just so you know, we are recording this, and we will make this available and get back out to you with a distribution of where this presentation's posted in the next few days into next week. So with that, let me again invite Tori Norville to take things from here. Tori is our fire science advisor, has worked a lot on that interface between open space and kind of the more natural landscape and then the urban landscape, and is working with lots of partners across the North Bay here on this topic. And we just thank you, Tori, for giving us a little deeper dive into fire behavior.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you all for joining us. So today I'm going to give us a very brief overview of fire behavior and how it behaves and moves on the landscape. I think it's very important for us to understand what fire is, so that way we can help mitigate it. So at its bare bones, fire is a chemical reaction between three elements: fuel, an oxidizer, and then heat. And it's usually depicted as this triangle. If you remove any one of those components, the fire will extinguish. So vegetation, artificial material, or even buildings can be combustible fuels, as Jana showed us earlier. The fuels burn by reacting chemically with that oxidizer, so usually oxygen within the air. And then these reactions usually occur at a higher temperature, so that heat source is that third essential component to fire, and it's usually a spark or some sort of friction that creates that feedback loop. When we talk about fire, we also need to talk about the methods of heat transfer. And so these, the first one is conduction. And so conduction is when you put your hand on a hot stove or a hot pot as you're bringing it out of the oven, and you get that heat and you're, ow, that's hot. That's conduction. The second method of heat transfer is convection. And so convection is the hot air moving upwards. So think of that smoke column that moves upwards, and that hot air, everything just goes up. The final one is radiant heat or radiation. And so radiant heat is when you're sitting at a campfire and you have to scooch back because it's too hot, you're experiencing that radiant heat. So these methods of heat transfer are going to pop up throughout a lot of today's presentations. And they're a part of how fire moves across the landscape and behaves, both in wildland settings, but also urban settings as well. So we have a second triangle. This is the fire behavior triangle. And so this triangle is comprised of topography, weather, and fuel. Notice that fuel is the same as in the fire triangle, but it's the only component that is the same. We're going to dive into each of the components more deeply. So the first one is weather. So weather conditions that really affect that fire behavior are wind, relative humidity, and temperature. And so temperature is can influence fire behavior when it's high temperatures. It can dry out and preheat those fuels, making them more receptive to that spark or that friction or that flame that's coming through. Relative humidity is the amount of water vapor evaporated in the air compared with the maximum amount possible at a given temperature. High relative humidity generally reduces that fire behavior. It's usually our more humid days. It's just not as dry. The lower the relative humidity values we see, so 20s, teens, single digits, those ones are we're gonna see an increase in fire behavior because the vegetation is drying out. It's just so dry and hot, usually hot during those days as well. And then wind speed and direction. So wind direction is expressed as the direction that it's coming from. So an easterly wind is going to be coming from the east. Wind speed is how fast the wind is moving, and it's usually expressed in miles per hour. Winds can influence the fire spread, either by pushing those flames or throwing embers out in front of the flame front that way. So those are just kind of the basic weather things. In California, we have, I'm going to use the term extreme weather events. Jana mentioned that we are in a Mediterranean climate, so we do see periodic seasonal droughts, with summer being our non-rainy season and then winter being more rainy, typically. We do see periodic longer droughts, years long, that can exacerbate that drying and dying of vegetation. This can exacerbate fire behavior since the dead fuels are easier to ignite than live fuels. And we also have things in California of wind events. In most people know the Fjord winds. In the Bay Area, we call them the north winds or the Diablo winds. In Southern California, they're known as the Santa Ana winds. These events occur when there's a low pressure system out over the Pacific Ocean and then a high pressure system over the Great Basin. And air is like liquid and wants to equalize. So it's going to rush from the high pressure zones to the low pressure zones. And as it rushes to those zones, it has a couple mountain ranges it needs to go over. So the air condenses, gets dry, and gets really fast as it comes down the mountain ranges. So this is when we typically see these extremely fast wind events that bring in this dry air. And when there's a fire or a spark, the wind just pushes it. And because it's dry air, it's drying out all that vegetation. And then allowing that vegetation to be more receptive to that flame. There are other wind events that occur in California, especially in the Bay Area, coming from the ocean onshore. But these are the ones that kind of encompass all of California. Finally, we have topography. So topography is the arrangement of natural features on the landscape. So whether or not we're hilly or mountainous, are we flat? Are we in a canyon? What aspect are we on? How steep is the slope? That sort of thing all ties into topography. For the purposes of landscaping and urban settings, I'm going to focus more on slope and talk about how fire can move very quickly uphill and back downhill slower. This is due to a term called preheating. And so basically, preheating is what occurs when the convection and the radiant heat of that fire goes up and starts drying out the vegetation above the fire. And so when that flame actually touches that vegetation, it's dried out enough that it can just ignite instantly. And so therefore we get fire that runs uphill. When you're going downhill with the fire, all that heat is still going upwards. So it takes a little longer for the fire to back downhill. The final component is fuels. Yana did a very nice job of introducing fuels. I'm going to take us a little bit deeper into fuels. We have a lot of categories that we can classify fuels. For landscaping's sake, though, there's really two buckets. There's the light flashy fuels, and then there's the more heavy fuels. Our light flashy fuels are those things like grasses, herbaceous, non-woody species. The heavy fuels, those are going to be more of our woody shrubs, trees, the bigger vegetative components of a landscape. The light flashy fuels, we call them flashy because they ignite real fast, they burn pretty quickly, and then they go out relatively fast. There's not much to them, they just kind of burn fast. The heavies, they take a little bit longer to ignite, but once they're ignited, they can burn for a very long time. They can put off a lot more radiant heat for a very long time, and they have the potential to smolder and hide embers, again, for a very long time. The other thing that we want to think about with the vegetative fuel is whether or not it's alive or dead. So alive fuels, they're going to have moisture in them, and their moisture is regulated through the root system of the plant and that sort of thing. Dead fuels, however, they do have moisture, but they're regulated more by the atmospheric conditions that are around them. So if it's a rainy, cold day and it's been that way for a few weeks, the dead fuels are probably going to be pretty moist. However, it's been hot and dry for a couple weeks, couple months, all the dead fuels are going to be pretty dry. And for the most part, this is true. The size of your fuels is going to change that dynamic a little bit of moisture level. So your smaller fuels are going to be influenced by that atmospheric conditions on more of an hour to a day ratio, whereas your larger fuels are going to be looking at days to weeks to acclimate to the atmospheric conditions that are occurring. When we talk about fuels, we also need to have a conversation around arrangement of fuels. So whether or not everything's clumped together or is there space between things. And arrangement also deals with not just the horizontal path, but the vertical path as well. So ladder fuels is the term that we tend to use for this. And basically ladder fuels is just the fuels that carry fire from the ground up to the canopy in a forest setting, but in an urban setting, it can be take something from the ground up into a roof, up into a tree canopy that can go to a roof of a building or a structure, hit a soffit or a gutter, that sort of thing. So Defensible Space is really trying to help us disconnect those ladder fuels from our structures and other buildings that we want to save. Finally, my last slide, Jana presented this pretty well, but I just want to reinforce it because Steve Quarles is also going to talk about it in a lot more detail. So just the pathways of fire, real again, there's three main ways. The direct flame contact, this is where the flame front is coming through, goes through the yard and touches the building and ignites it that way. Embers can fly through the air. They fall into a receptive fuel bed. This can be dry grass. This could be trash that's blown into the corner. This could be leaves in a gutter. This could be just you have the wrong roof. And then finally, there's that radiant heat. Radiant heat could be a bush, or in this case, there was the shed that caught on fire, and that heat was so hot that it ignited that other structure and started the fire that way. All of these pathways can be mitigated through defensible space and home hardening. And so, yeah, that's what I have for you now.
Tori, thank you so much for making that connection between the landscape and fire behavior and the structures. And to keep going on structures and structural vulnerabilities, we're lucky to have Dr. Steve Quarles join us today. Dr. Quarles brings a career of forest products, research and expertise around ignitability and combustability. And just really thank you, Dr. Quarles. Thank you, Steve, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining today. As is evident, I'm going to be focusing on the structure, on the building, the home, a home. I like this particular slide. It's developed by scientists at NIST, that's understanding of technology. And it really talks about the two basic things that you have to, that we all have to reduce the vulnerability of our home. The red button, the dial, is the filters, and this is what you as landscapers are going to have the most control over. You can remove, reduce, or relocate, move stuff. The other option is to harden the home. This is something that most of our contractors would be dealing with, and often you can do a combination of both things. So when you walk up to the home to do an assessment or to handle any landscaping desires of the homeowner, just remember that you're focused on the exposure part, but you should acknowledge that things can be done to the home also, and sometimes a combination of both is what it's doing. As Tori just mentioned, three things don't seem to resist: embers, the left-hand picture, ember ignition of a deck; radiant heat, the upper right-hand picture is a radiant heat example. This is an Eastern Tennessee fire back in the day, 2012. The home on the right, that's the burning, is igniting the home on the left. And then the lower right from fire in Nevada years ago, where fire burned up the draw and actually ignited the home by direct flame contact. So we have to acknowledge that post-fire studies have demonstrated that 50 to 90% of home ignitions occur because of windblown embers. And embers are really important because of what they can do directly and what they can do indirectly. As a landscaper, you're mostly going to be concerned with the indirect ignition scenarios. But in this slide, we see the two examples The slide on the picture on the left is a fence, a wooden fence. Embers ignited that fence without the help of any other thing. It's just the components of the fence ignited because of ember accumulation. You'll notice here pretty obviously on the horizontal member to the wooden post and the wooden planks. So in that little corner, embers accumulated and ignited without the help of any other debris, vegetative debris. On the right-hand picture, you have a couple of examples of indirect ember ignition scenarios. You have an ember ignition of debris in gutters. The left-hand gutter is a vinyl gutter, so it's going to detach pretty quickly and fall to the ground, and it's going to become a what's on the ground problem. Mulch, the kind of siding, these are going to be the things that dictate the vulnerability of the home. The gutter on the right is a metal gutter, so that debris, burning debris, is going to stay in place in that gutter, which is going to stay put at the edge of the roof, and you're going to have a flaming exposure to the edge of the roof. Typically, that's going to be either ankle flashing from the gutter itself or wood components in the roof sheathing, so sheathing and fascia. And you also see ignition of wood mulch on the ground. The new Zone 0 regulations won't allow wood mulch on the ground near the home. So, in the long term, that's not going to be a problem. But in the short term, that is a big vulnerability to homes. Ember ignition of debris, and all combustible mulch is easily ignited by embers. So as Jana had indicated, there's a saying that I've called for a number of years, this coupled approach. It's kind of like the two dials that we talked about in the very first slide. Vegetation, if you take this picture here, which was a sort of an East Bay picture, if you can eliminate all the greenery, this home is still going to have to resist embers, because embers are going to fly over any kind of vegetation management area that a typical homeowner is going to control and that you're going to have access to. So regardless of what you do to vegetation, the home needs to resist ember exposures. And you can imagine with this particular picture that fire could burn directly to the home, resulting in a flame contact exposure, and prior to that, a radiant heat exposure. So this, again, a combination of fuels treatment on the ground and hardening on the home is often the thing that gets done. And we're going to focus right now from this point on about the home. This, again, so radiant heat, materials make a lot of difference when you talk about radiant heat. And as we saw earlier, these are the two pictures that we can talk about radiant heat with. The homes in the yellow boxes are the same home. It's just the upper left was taken at 10 o'clock, let's say, and the lower right at 10:15. So very quickly, fire spread from the home to the right in the upper left picture, ignited the home in the lower right, and there you have it, an engulfed home. So this is an example of radiant heat. When it comes to embers, it's often detail-y things. So whereas when you do things to mitigate for radiant heat or flame contact, almost always you have to change out the material. But if you're talking about ember resistance, often it's just a detail thing. So here's an example in the right-hand picture of a non-combustible roof covering, but you have a bird's nest that's been built underneath the tile roof and on top of the roof deck, so that you can see in the red circle. Embers are going to ignite that fine fuels pretty easily, and you're going to have a flaming exposure to the structural parts of the roof. And so the embers allow the embers will result in losing the effectiveness of the Class A or non-combustible roof covering. So the mitigation strategy here is to plug that in so that birds can't build a nest, debris can't go, and embers can't go. So this is a relatively easy fix given this vulnerability of embers. And then if you have, a lot of what we talked about today is this near home zone and how it should be non-combustible. And in addition to that, in order to impart ember resistance to the home and to the siding, you need to have a vertical non-combustible zone also. As you can see in the lower left-hand picture, which is the same kind of picture that Jana showed, embers are going to accumulate at horizontal to vertical intersections. And that's the yellow arrow in the lower left-hand picture. They are going to flow away from the building to some stagnation point that's going to be a function of the height of the building. And that's the red arrow. So you can see two zones of accumulation in this lower left-hand picture. If you have mulch or some rough surface, the embers are not going to flow back hardly at all. You're going to really focus on accumulating at the horizontal to vertical intersection. So this area here is really important to keep clear of combustibles. And that includes the horizontal that the zone 0 is going to talk about, but it also needs to include the vertical, which the building code talk about. And the building code does. And so now this new regulation will address the horizontal part. If you have non-combustible siding, as you do here, you still need to worry about this because often combustible parts of the exterior wall hang out over the foundation, as we see in the right-hand picture. This yellow curvy arrow points to the wood sheathing that is now exposed should fire this combustible bomb to ignite and the flames burn for the building. And you'll have a flaming exposure to the underside of that wall, igniting the OSB, in this case, sheathing, but any kind of sheathing would be vulnerable plywood or OSB. So even if you have a non-combustible siding, this particular horizontal area needs to be addressed. So we normally talk about the home in terms of components. And so we're going to spend a minute just talking about the examples of the main components of the home. We're not going to talk about fences here because everybody's going to talk about that besides me. So we're going to start with the roof. We'll first talk about the wall in terms of needing to address any component as a system. So here we see ignited mulch that ignited the siding. Siding burned up the wall and entered the attic space through that gable end vent and through the opening in the under eave area at the gable end side of this test building. Flames can also spread and break glass in that window. So these are other places on the wall that can be vulnerable. And when we're doing home hardening strategies, we need to make sure that we've addressed all the things that a fire can get to. If you have combustible siding, you need to worry about the other things on the wall that the fire could reach should that combustible siding ignite, or in the case of the window, break. So we'll go on from there. The same thing is true with the roof covering. Here we see the roof. The red circle area is the part of the roof that a standard test method would inform you about. The Class A roof covering really only addresses the red circle part of this roof, and that is fire burning through the roof covering into what would be the attics. The yellow square things that we see at the roof to wall, in the case of the dormer, the roof to skylight, the roof to gutter, the roof to vent, and that upper right-hand yellow square. These are all things that are vulnerable, and I would argue since most roof coverings have a Class A rating already, you can walk up to 95% of the homes in Marin County, and they're going to have a Class A roof covering. The only one that won't be would be a wood shaken shingle roof covering. So you need to worry about these yellow square things, and that is often related to debris accumulation in the thing or on the roof next to the thing. So we'll see an example of that in a second. So here we do see that complex roof issue where you have debris accumulated on the roof that we see on the left-hand picture. This is on a Class A fire-rated roof covering, but it's next to a shingle siding in that split-level home. So this debris is going to come from nearby trees, overhanging branches. That's one of the main things about nearby vegetation is the accumulation the problem with the accumulation of debris. The right-hand picture is from the IBHS research facility test chamber where I worked for a number of years. And it shows ignited debris. And so this debris that you see in the left-hand picture will be ignited easily when wildfire threatens the house. You have a flaming exposure to the siding. And I would argue that the vulnerability of this roof that has a Class A roof covering is the siding next to it. So you need to address that. And you can do that by replacing siding locally, only where this happens, not everywhere, but only here. Vents are a moisture management tool that most homes are going to have. The under-eave vents that we see in these pictures are an example of typical vents on a house, whether it be a crawl space vent or other kinds of vents, that would vent the attic space. The vent on the right is in the open eave construction. So there's a vent in the blocking between the roof rafters. On the left, it's a soffitted or enclosed eave. And we know from experiments that vents that present the face that's perpendicular to the airflow, the kind of vent that would be in the right-hand picture, in the open eave construction and the blocking, these are far more vulnerable to ember entry than vents that are parallel to the wind flow, as we see in the left-hand strip vent in this enclosed or soffitted eave. So when you walk up to a house, you can see these vents, and you're going to want to make sure that they resist ember entry. And you want to be particularly careful for vents that have this perpendicular to wind flow face, as in the blocking as you see on the right. This is an example of where you can get information. In this case, we're going to talk about vents, and it is on the State Fire Marshal's Building Materials Listing website. The Building Materials Listing program provides information about materials that comply with state of California requirements, whether it be for wildfire or other fire issues. But we're concerned about wildfire here. And so you can go to this website, and with this category button in the red box, you can click on vents, and then you can find vents that comply with the state fire marshal's requirements. They also publish a book, a little pamphlet, as you see here, this WUI Products Handbook, and it gets updated occasionally. So I downloaded this yesterday, and you can see that the last time it was updated was September 2nd, 2025. So it's not every day they do it, but it's regularly updated. So you can either just download an entire manual or go to the website and look up materials by category. The under eave area is kind of interesting. We saw in the previous slide that vents in an open eave were pretty vulnerable to ember entry. And here we see that if heat can get up into this under eave area, as we see in the left-hand picture, these lime burners or gas burners are intended to be a surrogate for vegetation in that near home zone. And this experiment was clearly demonstrated that open eave designs were far more vulnerable to heat buildup. You can trap heat in the little cavities between where the roof rafters can trap heat because of the fascia board outboard and the blocking, and get more rapid lateral flame spread in these cases compared to the soffitted eave construction that you see on the right-hand side, excuse me. So because of the vulnerability to flames and the vulnerability to embers, enclosing the eave is a much better strategy from a home hardening perspective. Windows, there's been a fair amount of research on window vulnerabilities, and most studies indicate that glass is the most vulnerable part. And so really, if you want to know about whether a window is more or less vulnerable, the best thing is to look for that tempered glass bug. We see on the far right-hand picture, it's just an etching in each piece of glass, because you can't cut tempered glass. You cut it to the size you want it, you temper it, you put that little bug on it so you can see whichever piece of glass you're looking at. If it's tempered, it'll have this little etching. And that's a good way to know whether the window is more or less vulnerable to flames and radiant heat. Framing can be vulnerable, but the frame that is most vulnerable will be vinyl. and only that horizontal member is the most vulnerable part of it. But if you walk up to a home and you notice a vinyl window, often the cheaper, the more affordable strategy is going to be to do that, remove, reduce the vegetation around it to minimize the heat load on that window. If you're putting in a new window, then a different kind of thing would be the better strategy, and dual panes, both panes tend to be in this building. Decking, we all have decks. The idea is that the biggest fire is going to come from flames from underneath. The new regulation and the existing regulation really call for minimal vegetation and minimal combustibles under the deck. So the thing you need to worry most about, if in fact you have this good defensible space and minimal combustibles under the deck, is ember exposure. And the top of deck ember exposure, those flames initially can be pretty small, as you can see in the upper left-hand picture. So really what you want to do is stop the fire from getting to the home, and you can do that more affordably by creating its own zone zero, so to speak, where the deck meets the wall, as we see in this right-hand picture. So you have this metal piece, which can be a metal deck board, it can be a metal grate. The metal grate we used in this right-hand picture, that'll stop the fire from getting to the home, so you allow the deck to be damaged, but you save the home. It's more affordable. You accept the damage to the deck when you use this strategy. And people talk about deck enclosure. You really don't want to enclose a deck horizontally, as you see on the far left-hand picture, particularly if you have only if you have a deck board kind of a deck, because water can't get out. And you're going to have a decay problem and a plasma corrosion problem. I always say, I can't guarantee that your house will see a wildfire, but I can guarantee that it'll get rained on. And so you don't want to do anything that's going to make your home more vulnerable to water damage. If you're going to enclose a deck, and typically you only really want to enclose decks that are close to the ground, as you see on the right-hand picture, you do it with a vertical enclosure as shown in this right-hand picture, and you do it with screening, because that allows air to flow and you keep stuff out, embers out. So it's a better strategy all around. There are a number of documents that have been published recently that can provide a lot of information about home hardening. The University of Nevada and the left-hand picture, Wildfire Home Retrofit Guide, a lot of good pictures. The NIST published a very long article, report, this NIST Technical Note 2205. If you don't want to read the whole thing, tables A and D provide really good summaries of mitigations. Table A for embers and table D for radiant heat or flames. And then Fire Safe Marin always has a lot of good information about home hardening and other things and landscaping strategies also. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we can answer questions at the end. But I will stop sharing and move it to the next person. So thanks again.
Steve, Dr. Cross, thank you very, very much. And as Cheryl brings her slides up, we just wanted to give time so that you could understand the vulnerabilities of the structure relative to landscape design and installation. And now we are going to turn our attention to doing just that. And we're really lucky today to have Cheryl Drinkwater with us from Geometra Design, a architect and a home hardening specialist, and someone that's been in this arena throughout the Bay Area professionally. Just really glad to have your expertise here today. And I think you're going to help us a little bit with the business case, like why and how this learning can be important as these individuals serve their clients.
Yes, hi. Thank you, David and Kathleen, for including me in this training as the architect. I will briefly cover these topics. I definitely look forward to the Q&A, my favorite part. As an architect in a landscape training course, I am focusing more on the intersection between the house and landscape, just like everyone else, but more in terms of the structures and the design features. But I did want to start with the importance of this kind of training. This is something I've been trying to establish on my side of the bay, in the East Bay, for some time. And we have a lot of challenges just reaching folks who are doing the work. They're busy doing the work. How do we get them into trainings? So I just wanted to kind of briefly go over some of these benefits that you can also, this will benefit our communities too, so we can scale up. So in addition to getting the certificate of completion and the inclusion on the FireSafe Marin website, this certificate kind of makes you a little bit of a specialist, or at least the beginnings of a specialist. And so this helps you to start a conversation with your clients. You also can promote your specialty, right, on your website, or you could have signage if you have signage during a project, or I encourage you to do it, like this image in the top right, that you could have like a lawn sign, you could have your cards, and you can kind of, advertise that you have this training and that you can help people. People are going to be looking for you. We need more practitioners. This puts you in a good position to educate your clients on their responsibility to reduce risk around their properties. And then you can also start to encourage regular landscape maintenance plans if you don't have those already with your clients. But regular maintenance, there's going to be a lot of these flashy fuels, these light fuels that are going to be constant, especially if you have a redwood or a Monterey pine or even a eucalyptus to some degree. You're going to have a lot of this carpeting of small fuels that need to be addressed regularly. This should also include the next door neighbors, right? Next door, these are your partners, right? Each neighbor, if you have one on each side, or a corner lot with one neighbor. You can also assist your clients with their inspection report and work together on compliance. This will be something that people will need help with and may not be able to get all the answers from just calling the fire department. Kathleen will touch on this in the next section. And I just showed some images of, sometimes these are just maintenance of landscape. Other times we're talking about renovating the whole landscaping scope. Other times there are projects that may be part of an architecture project or a deck build or even fencing, and you may be involved in these in a design team. So I just wanted to touch on that. Also, attendees. I know you're not all in the landscape professional realm. We have a lot of variety here. Please encourage your landscape professional network to take these classes. Talk about it with them. Ask them when the best time to do it would be for them. I do have a survey that I've been circulating on the East Bay, and it's really tough to get it back. But we're trying to find out when is the best time, and we want to get more people who are doing the actual work in on these trainings. So now I'm going to just talk about a few other things, defensible space priorities. I believe Yana touched on this already, but we have these plastic waste receptacles that are often not considered. They should be protected, in particular from embers and radiant heat. They're often near the home, but sometimes they're just on the property. These will need to be protected either in a non-combustible structure, like shown just kind of an off-the-shelf or a customized one, or they need to be put away in a garage or just away from the home if you have no other option. Sheds are often made of wood. Some of them are prefab. They're very lightweight structures. They have gaps. They're often on pallets. They're lifted off the ground with a lot of airflow for good reason. They have vents, but these will need to be mitigated to protect these sheds, especially if they're near a property line fence, wood fence. And then there's all these miscellaneous combustible structures on people's properties. And I'm going to call out the one that I use the most in my presentations is the catio. This was a big surprise to me when I learned about these. These are, again, very lightweight, typically wood structures right up against the home, so the cat can access them near a window and possibly near vents, definitely near vegetation, and a lot of other things. So these should either be made of a more hardened material or they should be removed completely. And then there's also a lot of design opportunities when making these changes, and these may or may not be part of your scope if you're in the landscape realm, but many times they are. They may be part of a larger design team, as I mentioned previously, but trellises are often made of wood. We are now seeing that these trellises are going to need to be made with more steel structure, infrastructure like posts and beams, roofing certainly. If you're retrofitting, there are things you can do to either swap out posts, or maybe if you can't swap out the posts, you could harden just the base of the post with metal flashing. Keeping also, it will have to have its own defensible space, perhaps moving it farther away from the home. This one is fairly close and very large in the top left. The top right is another example of enclosing a lower deck, like about up to 4 feet. This is a CAL FIRE example showing corrugated metal enclosing the underside of the deck so that you're not dealing with these embers flowing in there and perhaps igniting combustible material. Also, I show these terracotta balls as a sort of illustration of, in lieu of plantings next to the home, there's a lot of opportunity for artwork, you know, steel structures, water features, these terracotta balls. These can be much closer to the home without ramification, and are also can be part of the palette or part of the gravel or other features of a landscape plan. Also wanted to touch on metal furniture. We need to replace wood and plastic patio furniture, whether it's on a deck or at a patio near home, with metal or some other non-combustible materials, most likely going to be metal in this case. Start thinking about those kind of replacements. These are much easier things to attain to reduce risk. And then also pavers and gravel and concrete. All of these are such amazing design opportunities. We're going to see a lot more with April's slides. Pavers come in all different sizes and shapes, circles. I'm seeing a lot of circles these days. Gravel and river rock come in all different sizes and colors. And then concrete is also a very malleable, if you will, and flexible material in that you can decorate it, you can color it, you can put, in this example, there's pressure treated wood to create a design that was very personal to the owner. So there's a lot of design opportunities. And we all are touching on fences and gates, and we know that we need to replace at least the gate or fence in the first 5 feet, or if not more, to create that disconnect of fuel. These fences and gates are a conduit directly to the home. Please research the building department if you're going to build new fences and gates for height requirements and possible permits. Typically, building departments do not require a permit if they're under 6 feet, but that will have to be reviewed. And then, of course, maintaining defensible space for existing near home wood fences. So parallel fences, fences between when neighbors are close together. You want to always maintain defensible space. This is a big one because it can often be part of that regular maintenance. A lot of, especially if you have tree litter falling. And then this is also a design opportunity, again, for the style of the home. I like to point out this in the bottom left. This is Sherman Builders. They're an East Bay and Marin County practitioner, contractor, and the gate is matching the existing wood fence, but it is made of fiber cement. So this is creating that disconnect and reducing risk to the home. There's also a lot of new products out there, kind of kits and systems. The one in the middle is one of those companies that makes aluminum fencing kits. This one happens to look like wood, but then they have other colors, and they're getting more and more colors as they become more popular and people learn about them. The top right is actually a metal fence, but this was more site-built, custom by a designer who does this kind of work. And then the bottom right, probably most people in this audience have seen from Fire Adapted Ashland, Oregon, did a nice fence and gate illustration, and this is a corrugated gate that is hinged on, away from the house, so that if it's opened, even it causes a greater disconnect and is more inviting for firefighters. And then the last slide I have is just some more considerations. You do not want to create new risks on properties, and I use the shed as an example. If you're moving a shed away from your home area, the first 5 feet, don't move it to an area that then puts it closer to your neighbor's house or your neighbor's fence or heavy vegetation. You don't want to create new risk for your neighbors, right, or for yourself. So placement of that shed will be very, very important, and of course, hardening it and creating its own, maintaining its own defensible space will be key. Also, work with adjacent neighbors, right? Again, I can't emphasize this enough. our homes are very close together in some cases, and we must work with our neighbors to reduce risk. So if you have a large woody hedge like this center photo, this is a good discussion about removal, but at least making it smaller to reduce risk. Also, you may be able to work within a Firewise group if your client is already in a Firewise group, or to learn more about Firewise and to encourage Firewise groups, especially if you have a group of clients you're working with in a tight-knit community, so that you can continue to reduce risk at community scale. The last slide here at the bottom right is, again, another landscape scope opportunity is to enclose these lower decks. Much simpler. You do not need frames or access doors, but just to use like a stainless steel wire mesh to enclose a low deck, and then that has its own defensible space, but at least could be part of a landscape scope with the river rocks in this case. So finally, consider a property's site characteristics as well. I haven't done that in these slides in the time allotted, but especially near home, if you are clearing 5 feet from a home, you want to consider if this home is on a slope, if that drop off is immediate, or do you have more space? And you may even need to hire a professional, like a specialist, like a soils or a geotech, to look at potential erosion or drainage issues that may be exacerbated by the removal of vegetation at the home. It is totally doable, but you may need a little help to get some feedback from folks that are specializing in that area. And Kathleen will talk a little bit about slope in the next section. Okay, thank you. These are my slides.
Cheryl, thank you. Really great to have been working with you through this training and to get the architect's perspective, and that you're helping lead us to do this better between the home and the landscape. Next up is Kathleen Cutter, Wildfire Mitigation Specialist with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And Kathleen is one of those hubs that works with defensible space inspectors and other stakeholder groups across Marin, and just brings a really rich, broad perspective on this need and the training, and has been another good partner to work with. Kathleen, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone else who's already spoken. So defensible space inspections, there's 2 goals to defensible space inspections. The first basically is to educate residents on action steps that they're required to take, or we recommend them to take, to make their homes safer from the threat of wildfire, which includes ember, fire, and heat, as we've talked about earlier. And the second thing, and I want to emphasize this as well, is we want to create a safe place for firefighters to defend homes safely, effectively, and efficiently. And again, to note, which we'll probably go on in the Q&A, is basically the state Board of Forestry is the state standard, and local agencies can bring those requirements. They can make them more strict. So we'll talk on that. So what are defensible space inspectors looking for? We've talked a lot about fire behavior, and how it affects a home. So the first thing that they're there to do is to evaluate plants and the plant condition. So specifically, they're looking for hazardous plants with certain characteristics, and they're looking for poorly maintained vegetation. I'm going to go into that in a little bit. The second thing they're looking for is they're focusing on the placement of plants on the property. Is there enough spacing, as like Tori alluded to, like, are they clumped together, or is there an unbroken amount of vegetation all the way up to the home? Are they just not in the right place? Like they're too close, right under the eaves. So you can see in these 2 pictures here, these 2 illustrations. This first illustration, there might be some hazardous plants that have to be removed, or plants that are dead or dying that have to be removed. And we might, as inspectors, point to take those out. But look at this continuity. If any of these bushes were to catch on fire, there's an unbroken line of fuel for fire to go all the way to the home and ignite that home. So the lower picture here is showing what that landscape should look like. It's more of a fire safe, or a fire safe landscape design. So what is a hazardous or poorly maintained plant? Well, the first thing we're looking for, as Jana alluded to, was thatch or densely branching vegetation, like we see in these pictures here. They tend to accumulate dead leaf litter or dead twiggy material within inside. So when they accumulate that leaf litter, embers falling through in a wildfire can ignite that plant from within. So by opening up that structure, having an open structured plant allows the dead debris to fall through that plant, so it's not going to catch in there. So when embers come and land in that plant, it should fall through the plant just like that debris. And that debris can also be easier cleaned out. So you're looking for the opposite of a thatched or dense branched type of plant. Second thing is some of these plants in here, again, the juniper and the thuja or the arboriva, is the Evaldo oils or resins. Those are likely to make the plant ignite more easily and sustain a flame. You would rather have plants that have a high moisture content, wide leaves, moisture-rich leaves, maybe like a succulent, but also you really want the stems of plants, especially near the home, to be not woody, but full of water. We don't want plants to shed a lot of debris, not a lot of leaf debris or bark. We want them to be easily maintained. If you have hard to maintain plants, you want to make sure that you don't want that. You want plants that you can stay ahead of the maintenance schedule. So if you're there, you're supposed to be there every month. You don't want plants that require maintenance every week. You want your plants to match your maintenance schedule. Again, as I said before, woody plants are not great to have right up next to the home. And I think Tori and Jana mentioned the fact that plants tend to age, or a lot of plants that tend to age, they tend to become woody as they grow older. Those plants we might point out as being not well maintained. So you have a choice. You can either take those out, hard cut them back if that particular species or likes that, or take it out and replace it with a young plant that has more plant moisture. Invasive plants are another one that's hard to maintain simply because they become weedy and they become hard to contain. So they spread easily and then become a problem. They again outpace your ability to keep them maintained. Again, a poorly maintained plant is a dead or dying plant or has dead and dying material within it. So that just might require you to prune it back or remove it if it's not, something you can bring back to health. It may be a poorly maintained plant or a drought stress plant. Again, the second thing we're looking for when we come to a home to evaluate it is plant placement. In this area, best practices, not necessarily law at this time, but best practices are no plants within 5 feet of the structure. You just want to break up that fuel continuity. You don't want to have a consistent full dense vegetation all the way up to the home, also create ladder fuel. You can see on the left here, you have some short but dead grass here, probably didn't water their garden or their lawn for the summer. But if something were to ignite that grass, what may happen is it ignites this sheared bush, which if you put your hands in there, or if you put your hands and spread out the branches in here, you'll see a lot of dead material. That will ignite, and then it will ladder up or extend up into the canopy of the tree, this tree, and it will make it very hard for someone to evacuate out of that home. You also want to be careful of roadside vegetation, and that includes the driveway. You want that person to be able to exit that home, get to their car, and evacuate safely. So roadside vegetation is an issue. And also along the that is what the resident is responsible for. They're responsible for the vegetation adjacent to their home along the roadside. Again, we want to break that fuel continuity, and that can also is vertical continuity. So here, if this were to ignite, if a cigarette or a chain would bounce on the ground, throw a spark into that bush, it's going to continue up into that tree. It's going to climb that tree and then affect those eaves. So you want to break up that fuel continuity. We talk about tree limbing. I noticed a question. We probably will hit more of it maybe in the Q&A. But yes, it's important that you don't create a bigger problem than you already have, meaning you want to limb up a tree 6 feet to 10 feet if the tree is tall enough. If it's a smaller tree, of course, you don't want to, if a tree is only 8 feet tall, you don't want to limit up 6 feet. You want to do 1/3 the height of the tree. Another option is moving out vegetation, or you want to keep any vegetation underneath that tree canopy to low growing, because a bush on fire can be up to 3 times its height when in flame. You don't want the flames of any understory bushes to hit those or get into those lower limbs, because it will become a canopy fire. And that is really difficult for people to, for firefighters to extinguish. Here's a good example of a limbed tree that's appropriately limbed. You can see the vegetation around this tree is low enough that it's not going to ignite the lowest branches of this tree and making it into a canopy fire. You'll notice that there's some other trees that are very similar in the background, but the bushes below these trees are too high. If those bushes were to ignite, the tree limbs above will ignite. Here is an example of what we are looking to do. We like the breaking up that fuel continuity. You can break it up by things such as pathways or maybe seating areas, as you see in this picture on the left. But notice how the plantings in this planting island are low to the ground near the home. And as you get further away, the plantings can be more dense, and they can be taller as they go away from the home. And the idea is you want to bring that fire intensity coming into the property. You want to decrease that fire intensity. You want to decrease that flame length. You want to slow that fire down so firefighters have a chance to get the upper hand, and also so people can evacuate. And also, as Steve said, keeping, you know, the, and Yana said, keeping that area immediately around the home safe from igniting. So there's just some other examples of planting islands here. Roadside vegetation. Again, this is dependent on the local area. We here in Marin like 15 feet of vertical clearance, and that's so not only people can evacuate safely, but fire engines can access these roads. You don't want, you know, some of these engines might have taller vehicles than we have in Marin. They might be responding from out of town. So we want to make sure that firefighters coming from out of town feel safe to travel through our roads to get to where they need to go. The other thing that we're looking for is vegetation along the roadside. Again, people are going to be, you know, firefighters are going to be accessing, or residents are going to be evacuating. We want to reduce the intensity of fire around that roadway so people feel safe and are safe evacuating. And again, so firefighters can access. And again, that includes basically grasses and weeds along the roadside, and some live vegetation as well. Here's an example where we really want to change what the kind of fuel is on the slopes below homes, or just in, you know, we have a lot of sloped communities. Tori talked about a bit about this, how fire below on the bottom of the hill can extends upward. The flames lay down against the hill. It preheats sorry about that. The heat from the fire below will preheat that vegetation above, and it will more easily ignite, throw embers, becomes a canopy fire, and that's what it looks like. So we're trying to stay away from that. How you can do this is keep the ground vegetation lower to the ground. So flames from that vegetation, if it were to ignite, do not reach the lower limbs of those trees. And you can make sure that you have some really good choices of plants on these slopes to have that keep that slope stability. And here's an example of the glass fire and how that actually worked out in real life. We have a lot of these 3 slope properties, obviously all burned, but the vegetation on the slopes were low enough that they might have ignited these trees on the edge of the top of the slope, but it didn't create enough heat to then radiate heat the home. Back behind did not ignite. Here you even have on the far left, you have trees that did not ignite despite the fact that this whole slope burned, and it's because that vegetation on that slope was low enough. All those homes are saved in these photos from basically how that slope was maintained. Another good thing is actually Tori had a picture of a similar wall at the top of the hill. That does 2 things. That keeps heat, it breaks the continuity of fires or fuel for the fire. It also deflects heat, but also if something were to ignite above and roll down the hill, it does not bring the fire down the hill. It stops at that wall. Here you can see a firefighter below in the lower right. There's a door there. The firefighter feels safe enough to fight the fire here, despite the fact, he's basically surrounded by fire, but here below, that fire is stopped with that wall. So that's pretty much the end of my slides. This is something that I think is a really good sum up. It's a fire smart landscape priorities. And we talked about that as in plant care and placement, and a little bit about the plant characteristics, what makes a plant hazardous versus one that is more a fire smart choice, and that the specific plant variety is not such an issue, except for when you're looking for one. Like there's lots of ceanothus, for example. Some of them are really low growing. You just don't want to accidentally go and grab the variety that is, 10 feet tall when you're looking for a ground cover. So that is it for me.
Kathleen, thank you. Again, for those of you joining us today, you're in that role of designing, installing, maintaining these residential landscapes. We really wanted you to have some insight into what those defensible space inspectors are working on, how they see things, and the reports that your clientele might bring to you as they're working with you to create fire resilient landscapes. So thank you. And to that point, I want to bring up April Owens, Executive Director for Habitat Corridor Project. April and the project work a lot on how to achieve multiple objectives across our residential landscapes, and April's designed many fire resilient landscapes, installed them, and teaches from them, and so we're lucky to have her just bring to you all some real world examples of options and choices you can do in your professional.
Appreciate that. I am actually having so much tech problems, David.
Okay.
I don't know what happened, but I'm not able to share my screen.
Okay,
then do you think you could bring that up for me?
I absolutely can.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what is going on.
No, I know maybe on our end.
Just having a tech issue day. Great.
Okay, there you go, and you just let me know.
Put those into to slides. Okay, perfect. So I am April Owens, and I'm here to present to you about resilient landscape design. Since 2017, you can do the next slide, David. Since 2017, my company has been went into the rebuild department and have been helping clients and really trying to understand these rules, trying to do best practices and learning along the way. And so I have a team that we do design and build, and then I also run a small nonprofit. Next slide. So I'm here to talk to you about the bigger picture resilient landscapes. I know we've been really focused on Zone 0, and there's just so much controversy around it, and we're excited to see these new recommendations come out. But what we really want to look at, and in California, we have all these conflicting messages for ourselves when we design. We have fire that became in the forefront in the last 10 years, but then water conservation has been an issue for us as Californians for all these years. And then we have this habitat, pollinator loss issue going on. So I try to design gardens considering all of those things, using native plants and fire-wise principles, and also really thinking about sustainability. Next slide. And so just to, we've all been talking about it, but just to have a slide, just to look at where we're right now, where we're at is Zone 0. The best practices are still not to have plant material in that zone. You can have trees, and we'll talk about more about that maybe in the question and answer. But I'm giving you some examples of maybe some plants that you could use on the edge of that 5 foot. So outside, if you do have a good defensible area right up against the house, maybe for 3 feet, and then maybe you could use a little bit of plants as you ease out into Zone 1. So we really focus on Zone 1 to be so beautiful and full of plants and have the this clean and green kind of way to look at that zone. And then Zone 2 is more of this, I see it as this biodiversity zone. So you can have larger shrubs, hedgerows, things like that. And so you can build out from your home in this kind of way. Next slide. So we'll talk about Zone 0. And when I go through these slides, I'm always like, well, we could edit that, or I could have edited that, or that plant shouldn't be there. And so it's really good. I wish we had more time for maintenance with this series, but hopefully we'll have another module that we can dive into maintenance of plants a lot more. But zone zero can be such an opportunity. We've played around with all sorts of pebbles. You'll have an opportunity to look at these slides and have these slides later. So, but I made a point to make sure to write on each slide what what the combo is, whether it's a Trinity mix or Noyo cobble. Next slide. In this zone, you could think water features. You can have your annual plants in containers. There's just a ton of opportunities. Like we always say, the home hardening is the most important thing. This is a great opportunity for patios. The slide on the left is of a landscape that this was our first rebuild we did. And I know even architects and all of us have learned a ton since the first rebuild. So this one was really fast, went up fast. They ended up doing like wood decks and using hardy board, but there's a lot that could have been done from the architect's perspective that we've all learned. And so we came in, and this actually was pavers on top of a burnt concrete. So we just put those on top. So sustainable wise, we tried not to take everything out because there was so much being removed during that time. And so that was a nice little, like, not a cheap fix, but a solution for that. Next slide. And then, thinking about even back to architects, and I was talking to Cheryl about this, but we have to think about now we don't have foundation plants. And I think that was the things that used to kind of cover up all the ugliness, at the foundation, like your utilities and things like that. So, looking at this slide, like we could think about like what kind of metal structure or something that you could do to hide these important utilities around the home. And then again, with the plantings and the lush container gardens. Next slide. This is from one of my friends, Native Valley Design in Napa, and she used Carapia, which is a low-growing ground cover, which I don't have a really good close-up of it. But in this slide, she didn't add that under the eaves with just with a rock or nothing ignitable. So, just looking at this, but this is kind of a fun modern take on a defensible space zone. Next slide. And then, thinking we haven't been putting any plants in that zone for a long time. So just trying to think about like, how can what is acceptable and what is, and it's about your risk too, like Yana was saying. So these are just some examples of early on designs that I did that I was adding a little bit of plants, and maybe we wouldn't have the ribes on the left side, the flowering plant in that zone, but we did do under the eaves with the pebble. The tough thing about plants in that zone, even on the very outskirts, is you still can't have mulch. And so plants really don't like to live without some kind of mulch to hold in moisture and keep out weeds. So I'm still kind of stewing on it and how we can do that and make a healthy ecosystem for the plants. Next slide. And just a bunch of ideas. So, we use drain rock mixed with, that's a really inexpensive. A lot of people are like, it's so expensive to buy rock. Pebble, there's all kinds of ideas for you in here. Next slide. And sorry, David, you're having to do that. I really apologize.
No, you're fine. Is this the right one?
Okay, great. So again, this is a pretty new job on the left side. Where in the edge, around the back, we use the drain rock. And typically on the right, in that landscape on the left, you wouldn't have so much mulch in zone 1 as we're looking out from the zone 0. These are just little baby plants and they hadn't grown in yet. And then on the right, you can see kind of a cobble mix where this is just kind of a junction, showing a few different examples at a demonstration garden we did. And at the end, I'll give you some examples of spots you can go visit some of these materials and kind of check them out. But I always recommend going to like a landscape materials yard. There's just so much creativity you can have in this space. So walk around, see what's there, look at the price list. Next slide. Another fun one, there's a very artsy couple, this was a rebuild, so the home is hardened, And so we played around with some materials that were on site, some of the boulders, and set them in some colored concrete. Again, with the cobble mix, you'll see that a lot. That was a nice little addition. And then some flagstone. Next slide. So here's where we kind of like talk about like the edges, like what is that edge of that 3 to 5 feet, and then what is happening in that little transitional zone, I think it's being called right now. This is a no-mow fescue from Delta Bluegrass that you want to keep mowed and very well hydrated, and it actually ends up needing quite a bit of water to stay this hydrated. It's a little Japanese maple kind of right outside that zone. Some good examples of containers with lush, well taken care of succulents. And then we used I got kind of tired of just plain old concrete, so we stamped this concrete so it looked like wood, so it gives like a little bit of texture to that space. And then under the eaves, we just used pea gravel in this example, and I'll show you what we use under our what we call pretty rock, the little top layer, in a minute. Next slide. We've all talked about fences and panels, and like Yana was saying, there's a lot of really great materials out there to play around with. Just on Wayfair, you can get these panels pretty inexpensively. Next slide. And so here's again with this is the Delta Bluegrass native bent grass, and we found that it's a little, around the zone 0, and this is a good example of a house that doesn't have eaves. So like Yana was saying that when we don't have eaves, you have to have at least, I think it's 8 inches or a foot. You have to have at least a foot of non-ignitable materials, and then maybe thinking about some of these little plant choices. And then as you're working out from this house, like this home, she actually lost her insurance. So we haven't really talked about insurance much, but a lot of times insurance agencies and companies will you have to do what they say, and they're usually more strict than these kind of guidelines. So she lost her insurance because of these oaks that are, we cleaned up that one to be 5 feet away from the house, but so insurance. This was a rebuild too, and so they're just very cautious in these zones. But pathways are really great ways to break up your zones. Next slide. And so then we kind of like, as we blend these zone 1 and zone 2, I hope these are giving you just some examples of some creativity that can happen and some ways you can talk to your clients about it where it's not so constrictive and feels so heavy. So in zone 1, the clean and green zone, we were talking about, stone walls and boulders and these well hydrated and maintained islands of plants. We can have ground covers, and I kind of go with 3 by 10 feet for the islands, but you just want to make sure that they're separated in a very good way with like gravel or pavers or pathways. You can have shrubs as specimen in this zone. So for habitat, it's really important to have shrubs in your landscape. And so you could have it, dot this zone in your islands with maybe some toyon or some coffee berry. Next slide. And then maintenance is key. This is super important. This is a rebuild as well, where we used crushed Trinity gravel in the zone 0 and a patio. And then as we went out away from the house, we did this island in kind of a swale, kind of a lower place in the garden. And these deer grass, I was really used them a lot, and right after, before the fires and after. And now I realize that you have to be fierce about your maintenance with these beautiful bunch grasses. So you're going to want to cut them back every year, and then they come back very lush and green. But it's important that with this maintenance issue with your bunch grasses. Next slide. Ground covers are a great option in this zone, and it's very soothing. Instead of having lawn, you can have like a nice green landscape. This has a lot of examples of just like this tapestry kind of approach to this zone. These islands can be low, they can, be lush and full of color. Next slide. And then I use 100% native plants in my landscapes. I don't, say that everybody has to do that, but for the pollinators and for the life in the garden, clients love what comes to the garden when you're using these plants. And so these are some examples of kind of lusher zone 1 plants. I wouldn't put them in zone 0, but just as you're like focusing on zone 1, you can really show off these beautiful, colorful plants. Next slide, please. And then between those islands, there's a lot of ideas for what can go in between the islands of plants in zone 1. So I'm just giving you some examples here. You can even use mowed grass. I had somebody come up to me at a wildfire earthquake fair last weekend, and she said, I just hate all this rock that you use in your landscapes. I had these big pictures up, and I said, well, you can have the mowed grass too, as long as it's hydrated. So I had kind of forgotten about that because we just got, we're really trying to be safe in these zones. Next slide. And then kind of this idea of smaller landscapes. I'm sorry I'm rushing. We want to have question and answer time. So kind of what would you do? And then next slide. And this is what we did. So we took out the shrub in the front of the house. That was a boxwood shrub that takes a ton of maintenance. We sheet mulched. We added this little seating area in the front yard of this little landscape. And then a year later, they had this very lush, beautiful planting island with hummingbirds and bumblebees, and they were super happy. Next slide. So this is kind of underneath this zone 0 kind of material. I try to stay away from landscape fabric because, as we all know, it just gets left behind for every homeowner in the future. And so we've had a lot of luck with this compacted base rock, about 3 inches of it. It's a very inexpensive material. And then we put about an inch of whatever material you pick out with your clients, or you pick out like the pebble or the cobble or the crushed rock or whatever. So this is kind of, you always end up getting weeds on top, even with landscape fabric. So we found this to be pretty successful. If you have gophers and your client's kind of fussy about that, you might want to put gopher wire under this. If they don't really care, you can just tap it all down after they figure out that there's nothing to eat in here. And then TerraPave is a like a decomposed granite with a binder in it that it holds up pretty well and doesn't get stuck on shoes too badly. Next slide. And then I'm just going to really hit on planting design super quick. Next slide. These are just a few examples of plants that I thought could be like in that transition zone. Natives, great for habitat, really lush like the fragaria, the beach strawberry or blue-eye grass. Like I think this is where we're getting to. And then I started thinking about meadows, like that the edge of the meadow could fall into that kind of zone 0, and you could create a pretty softening happening. Next slide. And then this is just just an off-the-cuff list of some plants that I know we don't do plant lists, but just some plants to maybe look up on calscape.org and read about them. That's a great resource from the California Native Plant Society. But just some things to soften that edge. Next slide. And then this is Defensible Space. This is a gorgeous garden full of natives. On the right of the slide, when you're looking to it, is the home with a container with Daphne in it. They really wanted some Daphne. And then a nice big pathway with flagstone, and then these islands of plants on a hillside. So you can see that you can have those walls as your separation of islands. Next slide. And just some demonstration gardens in Novato. I know we have a lot of folks from Marin, and so the Novato Fire Protection District Administration Building has a demonstration garden that kind of focuses more on professional commercial landscapes. Next slide. And then Fire Station 63 on San Ramon Way in Novato is more of a home, kind of a home landscape situation. I love this shale chip. I don't know if any of you all have seen it, but it's a beautiful kind of gray, more modern kind of looking chip. Next slide. And then I'm a member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, and we have a great website. So we have some plants on there and ideas about plants, and we're going to have to be shifting our whole website around soon, but it's a really good resource. Next slide. And then this is just reach out to me if you have questions, April@habitatcorridorproject.org. And if you have any kind of questions as a landscaper, homeowner, anything, I'm happy to answer questions because I know we don't have a ton of time today, but that's it for me.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
April, really appreciate it. you definitely helped bring it to the real world examples
Yeah, we're
with
going
those
to try to have
practices.
modules. We're going to try to have
Yeah.
modules of these in the future. So I think maintenance and plants and all that stuff can come in later for
Yeah.
if people are interested.
Let me do a little time management. Let me
Yeah.
ask all presenters to open up their cameras for starters. To those in attendance, I do want to say we'll stay on here and answer some questions. We might go a little past 5 if that's okay. I do want to thank our presenters and our attendees for the questions that have been shared and already answered. So please, hopefully look through those and see how those answers have served everyone's purposes. Yana, maybe to start with you real quick, when will these guidelines be approved or, in effect?
Yeah, terrific question. So thanks for all of you for hanging on. I know that this is a bit of a work in progress, and as the organizers, they spent some time really debating about whether this was the right time to have this conversation, and it felt like it was better to get out in front of these issues, especially in advance of the fire season, so that we don't miss an opportunity to be talking about what's really important from a fire risk perspective. The Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, which is a California state board who is in charge of writing the draft regulations, have been working at this for many years. They released a draft in April, which is what I shared some images on. It was pretty well received, and so I expect they will take it up at their June meeting, and it will likely be resolved by the summer, sometime in the summer. They meet once a month. And so that would take effect immediately for new construction. And then it would be phased in for existing construction. I do just want to underscore, and this is a longer conversation than we have time for today, is that the insurance companies understand this stuff. So if you're waiting for like the definitive this is and that's, keep in mind that this is not new in the insurance framework, and so being an early adopter is something that will probably be of benefit in the long run, while we settle out on what these last bits of pieces really mean specifically. And this is a journey. There's going to be a lot of evolution to it, and so just be aware that these areas are really critically important in fire performance and survival, and will make a difference in the long term.
So there's a lot of different questions about zone 0, the 5 feet. No plants, some plants. I don't know. Maybe I could ask Kathleen or again, Yana and others. Just be really succinct. But what's allowed?
Under the state's draft standards, the best practice is no plants and no combustible materials. There is tolerance under the state standards for some low combustibility items from the drip line out to 5 feet.
The drip line of the eave.
The drip line of the eave. So if your eave is 1 foot, then you have 4 feet of low combustibility.
Okay.
If your drip line is 4.5 feet, you can have a 1/2 foot of low combustibility out to 5 feet. And then, then the sky's the limit in terms of how you think about it moving to those next zones. Keep in mind that the local responsibility area jurisdictions have the authority to write their own standards as long as they meet equivalency or greater. So I brought forward, and I know there's been back and forth in the Q&A, that locals will be thinking about this and thinking about it in their own way, and they have the authority to do that. So
let me tag Cheryl and April. Hearing that, starting to understand that, how does that influence what you're going to be doing or what you're going to need to adapt and change?
I kind of talked about that a lot in my workshop.
You did.
Just like how do we make that work for folks? I don't know, Cheryl, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if we use your slide, I think it became slide number 7 about, the architect would address this foundation plant removal and what do you do with all those utilities showing. I mean, I think it could be anybody in a design team to say, hey, can we come up with a metal screen or something and tie it into the landscape plan as a whole? And then maybe there's other screening that's complementary on other parts of the property, tie it all together.
Yeah, great. And Steve, a couple different ways it got asked, but just can you, and it also was in a couple of the different presentations, can you confirm for us about a deck and it's raised, and what do we do with screening, and what are the heights, what's required? I know you answered 1 or 2 of the questions in there. Can you give us some insights on that?
So the deck above the ground, definitely the lower to the ground, the more effective or needed this enclosure will be. but 4 or 5 feet is would be the sort of the minimum. There's no need in enclosing a deck much higher than that off the ground. I would reiterate that you have to worry about moisture issues, and so if you have a deck with deck boards enclosing horizontally by attaching non-combustible panels to the bottom of the joist is not the thing to do, because you're going to have the deck fall off from being rot or fastener corrosion. So don't do that. And even if you enclose the deck vertically, like around the perimeter, if you enclose with a solid material like a fiber cement product or a metal product, you don't want to do that either, I don't think, because you have the same issue with regard to moisture buildup. You can say, I'm going to ventilate that opening as if it's a crawl space, but you got to remember that water's coming from above and below, and how much is effective ventilation, how much we need is really uncertain. It's just far easier to take care of the fire problem and the water problem by enclosing vertically with screening. I just can't say that enough.
No, helpful. I know a couple different ways it got tried to be answered, and the question about trees and how far, the 5 feet, the 10 feet, and then there's some things about tree health and questions. I just wondered if anybody wanted to share the answer they wrote in the Q&A for a minute. And I also want to stress, this is one of those topics where we know more training, more opportunities are going to be needed. So whatever shared today, know that as Board of Forestry finishes their guidelines, as we in this community, you attending this workshop, we're going to need to come together and learn more about that. So, but go ahead, Steve. I think maybe you took a stab at answering that.
No, I just wanted to say one more thing about those doggone decks.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Didn't mean to preempt you.
I had my hand up too.
All right.
So
Steve
decks,
and Cheryl then on decks.
Elevated decks overhanging a slope. If your house is on a slope, really, enclosing isn't going to help. But the only real thing to do, even if you have a good zone 0 under the deck, is you have to consider veg management downslope of the deck. And if it's a tree, that means removal of the tree or creating islands of vegetation so that flames from the burning thing can't impinge on the underside of the deck. And a strategy that can be used if you're on a slope and you have a deck overhanging the slope and you only have shrubbery or brush downslope, you can build a retaining wall and to deflect the flames of burning vegetation burning uphill. But if that vegetation is trees, you're not going to build a retaining wall tall enough to take care of a crown fire. So this retaining wall downslope only works with low growing or shrubbery kind of vegetation.
Got it. Cheryl, what did you want to add about that?
I was just going to add about the slide I showed with the metal enclosure under the deck. So that was a perfect example of, neglected to mention about ventilation, and that would have to be factored in. There's a calculation you could do that's for buildings, but perhaps a much more airy design. It could incorporate metal, but metal mesh is going to allow a lot more airflow.
Okay, yeah, helpful. Jana, I know you kind of started to answer, and Lily, I'm sorry if your original question got deleted, but this is about how do we manage the trees for this zone 0 and manage trees for their health, the ways in which there might be counter advice from the arborist or just we need to get some of these questions resolved, Lily. We may not have the answer today.
I'll just say it really depends on where we're talking about, the scale we're talking about. I put just something into the chat here. If we're talking about right in zone 0, I mean, it's not the best idea to have a tree right in zone 0. If you have one, certainly we understand the shade and the attributes that trees provide, but they also drop a lot of debris in places that you don't want, like your gutters and right around your house. But the big issue is really trying to remove those lower ladder fuels so that fire doesn't climb into the canopy, and taking off some of those lower limbs to do that is the recommendation. If it's a big mature tree, 6 feet of clearance is great. But if you've got a young tree, you don't want to take more than a third of those lower branches of the total crown, because you'll be reducing the health and vigor of those trees. There's a lot in tree pruning. My field is forestry, among other things. And so, there's a lot of things that Lily and I could talk about in terms of moving to the landscape scale, moving farther away from the structure itself. And what type of tree type are we talking about in general? Appreciate the conversation. I think it is, as you say, a later more in-depth conversation.
Well, and I think whether it was Kathleen and or April, and the way you presented zone 0, 1, and 2, are we talking about small landscapes and it's almost all zone 0, or is it zone 1 and 2 and then out into even a more natural landscape? So appreciate that, Yana. Lily, hopefully that helps for now, and please let's find a way to maybe connect and get you more answers.
You have room for one more comment on trees?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I know we were talking about mature trees, but also if you have cut down a tree and then you get all these volunteer trees that are on their way, like a redwood, for example, the time to cut those is while they're small. I talk to owners all about this a lot. You want to do them when they're small, when maybe you can even do it yourself. You do not want to let that get delayed so that the tree becomes something that you have to hire somebody to remove it.
So Bella, I don't think we have any more unanswered questions, and we went through a couple of the ones that were recurring. What I want to do real quick, if I may, for those online, I want to make sure to share with you quickly. Hopefully you're seeing this now, the link for our post-workshop survey. I will also send this out, but I would really be grateful if you'd spend a little time taking this survey. There's the QR code and the link for it. And it'll let us get ready for future trainings. We've got a few questions in there for you to give us feedback on what more you'd like to see. It's also the way we'll confirm you were here and get you your certificate of completion. And if you're in the professional landscaping design, installation, maintenance business, the realtor business, will get your business posted on FireSafe Marin for having completed this landscape workshop. So hopefully that's up long enough for folks. I can put it back up right as we close, but let me stop share and just reemphasize that I'll send out a follow-up email. It'll have the links and different resources that presenters shared. It'll eventually it also have the link where we post this training so that you can access it, different parts of it at different times. And so we just want to thank you on behalf of Cooperative Extension, the UCCE and our fire network, and of course the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, who helped pull this together. Thank you to our presenters. What a great team that worked together to really dovetail these topics, and I think did just a fantastic job. And I want to just hand it over to Kathleen for any parting comments you might want to make.
Well, again, thank you all for attending. Again, it's really important stuff. The residents are really clamoring for this information. It's you all are the folks that can really bring back a beautiful aesthetic. We're not in the Southwest. A lot of us don't live in the Palm Desert or LA area or wherever we are. We need to make an aesthetic that matches our homes and whether they be modern or cottage home, or we need to match the aesthetic towards that home where that client is, because that's what they need. That's what they're asking for. But how can we do that in a way that's fire smart, so we can protect our homes, protect our memories, protect our families, and that's the objective here. So we really appreciate this. We understand this is merely an intro class. We are, as April said, and Yana, we're going to be all trying to build modules that kind of hit each one of these topics, because we know it's pretty extensive. So again, thank you for your participation. We look forward to giving you those certificates of completion so we can get you on that FireSafe Marin website as a landscape professional that can be a go-to person for our residents. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. So with that, I'll just share again the workshop, the link to the survey, and just hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Thank you for staying with us a little bit past 5.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody for staying on. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.